Hello, and welcome to another edition of the Storied Arcs podcast. I am your co-host, Mike.
And I'm your co-host, Alex.
And this time we are gearing up to do another one of our book club style deep dives, but this time it is a one-shot episode, which will be our next episode, were The Seeds by Ann Nocenti and David Aja. But before we get there, as is our custom, we will do kind of a zero intro episode to introduce especially the unique publishing situation around this book, the comic legend of Ann Nocenti, and I guess maybe fair to call him a rising star, David Aja. I mean, I think he's pretty well established now, but
he's pretty well established for not having the longest CV.
Front end of his He's still on the front end of his career, I would say.
Probably so. Yeah. But also Karen, comics legend Karen Berger, who are kind of the three main driving points behind this book.
Yeah. I think without any further ado, I'll just let you dump straight in, perhaps to Ann or whomever.
Well, let's get into it. You mentioned the kind of the unique publishing schedule of this book, and I don't think it's unique by choice. It probably by accident. But as you mentioned, this book came out on Dark Horse on what they called the Berger Books imprint. Berger Books, again referring to Karen Berger, the legendary comics editor. We'll get into more of her career later. But this imprint started in, I guess, 2017, 2018. And so this book, The Seeds, was kind of an early comic that they put out on that imprint. And I believe it was initially planned to be a 4-issue miniseries, which is the 4 issues that are collected in the trade, but only 2 issues only ever made it to print. Issue 1 came out August 1st, 2018. Issue 2, September 12th, 2018. So, it's 5 weeks apart. It's about a month schedule as it normally is. But then it was crickets. And even if you still go on some of the kind of the comics tracking websites, you'll see an entry for Seeds number 3, which just has a TBA on the release date because it's still kind of there and never ever came out. And for the longest time, I mean, I had assumed that the series was dead, that they got 2 issues in, and then for whatever reason, it was never going to finish. I didn't know what the situation surrounding it was. But then, all of a sudden, 2 years later, December 23rd, 2020, kind of still in the middle of the main brunt of the pandemic, the full trade shows up, and it's like, hey, here's The Seeds trade paperback, here's the whole story all at once. And it was kind of out of the blue, and it was like, oh wow, this thing's still alive. And I had absolutely no idea, so I was thrilled. But again,
I think the trail of clues here, if you look in the back of the trade, there are really wonderful letters from David Aja and Nocenti,
yes,
both written like June 2020.
Yes,
meaning this thing before the pandemic was an excuse. This thing was, they pumped the brakes on it for one reason or another.
Yes. Yeah. And so the fact that they finished it right before everything kind of shut down, and then, to have it release and still be alive, because I had assumed, that it was a neat story I was in and felt really bummed, like, oh, this thing's not going to go further. And it seems strange that, a book on a line kind of curated by Karen Berger would not reach, the story wouldn't have a chance to reach its conclusion, like it seems strange that this book would come halfway out and then just stop. So it was a nice surprise when the trade eventually did come out. I guess that's 2 years ago now as we're recording this, but the Berger Books line, I mean, it's one of those things that, it doesn't have the longest list of titles, but most of them are excellent. They're great creators. And that comes from, I guess, just the power of the name, Karen Berger. She was, back in the day, late 80s, early 90s, she was an editor at DC, most notably edited Alan Moore's Swamp Thing and Neil Gaiman's Sandman. And because of the success, I think particularly with a lot of UK writers and creators, that led to them creating Vertigo. She co-created Vertigo in 1993 as this imprint that, as much as any comics imprint, I guess it's not a new publisher like Image was, but Vertigo as an imprint of DC just changed the face of comics as far as I'm concerned. They we're talking about, Swamp Thing came over there. There was Sandman, there was Hellblazer. Then you move into kind of the next kind of version of Vertigo, like Fables, 100 Bullets, Ex Machina. So many great books in the past 30 some odd years, before Vertigo finally was closed down as an imprint. The best titles and the best creators had titles on Vertigo. And so Berger's name became attached, at least in my mind, I think a lot of readers' minds became attached with quality. That this is a book on Vertigo. That means it went through whatever their process was, like their vetting process. And if it came out on Vertigo, there was a stamp of approval that said, these people have good taste. And so if they're putting it out, if they're working with these creators to tell this story, it's got to be worth reading. And when she left Vertigo in 2013, which was a couple years before Vertigo actually finally shut down during kind of DC's mass reorganization, and she started this imprint over at Dark Horse, she brings that cachet with her. And some of the books that came out that I've read that were awesome. I really loved Invisible Kingdom, which was G. Willow Wilson and Christian Ward. Everything, which is Christopher Cantwell, and the artist I'm forgetting, I'm so sorry. She Could Fly, another Christopher Cantwell book with Martin Mazzaro on art. LaGuardia, Ruby Falls, Air, just some of these great books that are out there. And again, it's not like they're pumping out, 40 books a month or whatever, like DC, Marvel, or Image or something.
Right. They're not doing 12 Batman titles at a time.
It's a very curated line, but because of her name, because of the reputation that she brings through her history in comics, it's a safe bet that this is going to be an incredible story. It's going to challenge you. It's going to make you think, and it's going to be the best creators because they're going to want to work with her, and you as a reader, you're going to want to read it. So, this being an early book on the Berger Books line, or meant to be an early book, it was when issue number 1 came out. It wasn't early.
Yeah,
book.
I mean,
it turned out to be, but
that happens.
And having two great creators on it, like I said, it was a driving force for people to pick it up, and why I was so bummed when it seemed like it was dead.
Yeah, well, I mean, and I think Berger's one of those people who, once a creator has worked with her, they want to re-enlist.
I think
because,
so. Yeah.
I think I was telling you, and I still haven't read it yet, but I picked up all of, I had that Blind Trust in the Vertigo imprint, and the series Air, which was like a 24 issue thing from G. Willow Wilson on Vertigo. It was like 50 cents an issue. They had a whole run in the bin, and I was like $12, no brainer. So I picked that up, and right now, Christopher Cantwell is a very busy man,
yes,
but still carving out time for Berger.
Yeah. Yep. Along with his, he's doing
and She Could Fly,
done a lot of Marvel work.
Yeah.
And still, his indie stuff, his creator own stuff is on Dark Horse on Berger Books.
A very strong Iron Man run from what I've seen, which I have limited exposure to, but She Could Fly was great, and that's another Berger book. In fact, I might even want to do that one on here at some point, if nothing else, because it's like that's the way to talk about Christopher Cantwell. Like, we're not going to do an ongoing Iron Man coverage here.
We could maybe a couple of his Berger books there. It's a possibility to do that. But yeah, no, I agree. I think she's someone that she wouldn't have lasted as long and been as successful and as well known if creators didn't want to keep working with her as an editor, if they didn't trust her insight and her expertise, they wouldn't keep coming back to her. So yeah, it's just her name is enough to really sell some of these books for a certain set of comic reader. And she's someone that, if you're interested in the history of comics, a name you absolutely have to know, one you have to know and recognize.
Yeah.
And really the same, now that I said that, the same really goes for the writer of this book, The Seeds, the Ann Nocenti. She is someone who also, if you're going back through the history of comics, she's a name you're going to have to know. She made her name at Marvel, mainly as an editor, but also as a writer. Another comics legend. She was, I believe, kind of the second major editor of the Uncanny X-Men and New Mutants, as Chris Claremont was writing it through the 80s. I think Louise Simonson was kind of the first main editor for the first 4 or 5 years, and then Ann Nocenti came on. And while she was editing that Claremont's run, she's credited as co-creator with some all-time great and indelible, mutant characters like Longshot, Mojo, Spiral, kind of the whole Mojo verse. If you're an X-Men fan from the 80s and all that, all these names should jump out at you. And then also, after being an editor there, went on to write and wrote a lot of the, I'd say a lot of the street level characters. Spider-Man and really Daredevil is probably the one she's most known for. Again, co-created with credited as co-creator of Typhoid Mary and that whole saga, that whole run. So she is someone who has been around as both an editor and a writer, and even a limited experience kind of crossing the street and going over to DC much later on in the New 52 era of DC. So in like the 2012, 2013, sometime it's that realm. She wrote a run on Catwoman during that time. So
she also picked up right and then handed off to Lemire on the Green Arrow.
Did she work on Green Arrow? Okay, yeah.
Yeah,
she has a little run there. Yeah.
She took that at 7 and then carried it through to the Lemire Sorrentino. And, really when you think about her traits as a writer, Green Arrow is kind of the perfect DC character for her.
Yeah, I think it really fits.
It doesn't translate from the X-Men stuff, but trying to capture, he's a vigilante, but he's also kind of the social justice warrior. Mm-hmm. He's kind of the paradoxical righteous billionaire.
Yeah.
Which is what I always liked about when people capture that tension of the character that and I feel like it sometimes goes unaddressed with, Bruce Wayne.
Well,
he gets a free pass on being a billionaire.
They are meant to be like of the same ilk, but approach kind of both their superheroing and their public facing lives radically differently. In terms of Ollie and Bruce there. But yeah, no, Nocenti has written and she hasn't written like nearly as much. Isn't like she spent the last 30, 40 years consistently as a writer or in comics. I know she's done a lot of other things, filmmaking, journalism wise. She's very active and has a lot of other things outside of comics. But, when she dips her toe back in, I think it's always really cool. And that was one of the things that really excited me about this book was like, oh, hey, Ann Nocenti's writing another book here, and she's working with David Aja, who is one of
let's just get there
for such a, I would say overall a very limited, a very short kind of bibliography, specifically with interior art. He is someone who is, I think, just instantly recognizable, who has done such incredible work because they're really, I mean, when you think about his interior artwork, his interior pages and storytelling, it really comes down to just two series. It's Immortal X-Men. X-Men. Jesus, sorry.
No, Iron Fist.
Yeah, Immortal Iron Fist with which is co-written by Ed Brubaker and Matt Fraction, and then the run on Hawkeye with Matt Fraction.
Which we've already maligned Danny Rand on this podcast. There's no reason to do it again. But
listen,
let me say the artwork is the best part of that Immortal Fist
that Immortal
run.
Iron Fist is probably one of the better Iron Fist runs I've ever read. It's the one where it's probably the least cringy because Danny is meant to be kind of the butt of some of those jokes.
Right.
But it's about as good as you can, I think, about as good as you can get for a Danny Rand Iron Fist story. But yeah,
the Hawkeye was everything.
The Hawkeye's transcended. Yeah. That's an unbelievable run. But outside of that, he's done a lot. He's done a lot. You see a lot of his work on covers. He does a ton of work on covers. There was a Scarlet Witch series from a few years back. He did I think 12 of those. I think they might all just be straight two-tone, red and white. Maybe there's some black in there, but they're stunning covers. Absolutely stunning. He did the whole run. He just did the run on the mini series recently for the Krakoan Age of X-Men for X-Corp. So you see his stuff on covers. He does a lot of variant covers. He's obviously very in demand for that, but he doesn't do a whole lot of ongoing interior artwork. And so for him to do, and even this book was meant to be 4 issues. It's a miniseries, not even meant to be ongoing, but still just having his artwork on the interior is always great because there is relatively so little of it versus some of the other artists and some of the creators that we've talked about. So he just doesn't have the long list of titles, and yet and yet he's still considered, one of the best, and people automatically know his stuff, and they identify with it and they love it.
Yeah, and I would imagine it's probably the pace of uh the work, that keeps him from doing too many ongoing, monthly titles, because the detail in his, and it's not like realism, like he's, doing just straight portraits or anything like that. But I don't like, I don't want to cheapen an artist by comparing them to another artist, but to me, it has like some of the rough texture of like a Andrea Sorrentino. Um, there is some of like the when he shadows and he does the little dots.
Yeah.
That kind of like pixelized look is something that like Mitch Gerards does very well.
Yeah.
But Mitch draws and colors and everything almost exclusively digitally at this point.
Yes.
And David is completely analog.
Yes.
And I think, and there's, I don't, to be clear, that is not a judgment statement in either direction. They're both perfectly valid mediums for making art. It just is what it is.
Yeah.
I do suspect that doing it all analog is a tad slower.
I would assume so. Mm-hmm.
And, doing that level of detail and that many panels, because there are a lot of 9-panel pages in this book, especially side by side. And I love a layout of 18 panels. Like when you open it and lay it flat and you just see, like I love the pace of reading that establishes.
Yeah. And I think, the 9-panel grid is something that if you've read both the Mortal Iron Fist and Hawkeye, that structure is something they use quite often. And they really played with that. They played with it a lot in Hawkeye as well, where they would subdivide even more, kind of use that to help literally frame and tell their story. But it was always based in the 9-panel format. And they stick very, very rigorously to that in this book. And it's, it's a storytelling choice. And even when there are panels that maybe bridge across, like it's one panel across all three, or it's the top 6 are on one panel, there are still kind of subtle subdivisions in the way the characters are framed and where they're placed. So you still get the feel of kind of 9 individual images. And it's something they really work with it and use very effectively, very, very effectively throughout the book, as we'll get into. But yeah, it's, the 9-panel is, you think about, Watchmen is always the one that people come to, like this is like that invented 9-panel, which it didn't, but that's probably the most famous. Tom King, when he works with Mitch Gerards, loves to use 9-panel. Tom King just loves 9-panel in general. So
I think that's what made me love it, even though I know he didn't invent it. In fact, I thought it was intentionally, when Tom King does it, an homage to like Golden Era, because when you read through really old comics, they tend to be 9-panel stuff, and I think that was because you could do less detail per panel.
It wasn't
you
about
could scratch them out a lot quicker.
Yeah, you don't have these big splash pages. You're not doing things like we talked about with like Brubaker and Phillips, where the image actually goes beyond the printed part of the page. It fills up. They're doing things to make it visually appealing to the eye and to force your eye to go in certain places, look outside the bounds of what the actual like physical lines are on the page, versus the very rigid 9-panel grid. So even when it's not 9 panels, when it's 2 or 3, everything's still subdivided the same way. You can see the lines that are there. So it's an effective storytelling method, especially when they stick to it so rigidly. But yeah, it's something I think he's very used to. Like I said, both Mortal Iron Fist and Hawkeye are set up the same way. So it's clearly something I would assume he likes to do. I guess if he didn't like to do it that way, he probably wouldn't want to keep
yeah, he probably wouldn't keep taking these jobs. But
yeah.
I mean, to me, it's great effect. I think I do love the I just was looking slightly beyond my screen, and I own some original comic art, and now the one that's directly above your head, where I'm looking at,
Yes.
is a 9-panel by Matt Kent from Mind Management. That's an original piece. So clearly I love the 9-panel. I get up and stare at it every day for 8 hours as I'm at my computer. Yeah, so I mean, to me, I think it's great storytelling. It's great pacing device.
Yeah.
Especially when you're, if you're just having two characters have a conversation,
Yeah.
breaking it apart like that instead of just giving them text bubbles that take up half the page.
Which is that's a very, other creators. I mean, that's a very Bendis thing to do. You're gonna have two people there, and you're gonna have just loads of word balloons as they go back and forth, with their witty kind of their witty banter. But yeah, it's an effective storytelling device, and there's a reason why it works and why it's kind of so tried and true. And I think it's very effective in this book. As we'll get to when we get into a next episode. But it seems to fit his storytelling. Maybe his eye, the way that he sees story, the way he breaks his art down. It seems to fit to be automatically subdivided in these kind of smaller segments, these smaller pages within a page. And it's very, he said he's very effective at it. So, yeah.
Yeah. So I'm sure we will bask in the glory of his artwork
I think
as
so.
we go
I
through
think
the
so.
book.
Yeah. Should we get into a little non-spoiler discussion of the book itself? Try to give a little bit of as best we can, a little bit of
yeah, because I've got to say,
summary.
I've got my clip is loaded and I'm ready to start firing as soon as we record the next one.
Yeah.
But I don't want to spoil it.
Yeah.
So I'm very active on Goodreads.com. I don't know if you knew that about me. That's like my favorite social media, because in order to register an opinion on anything, you have to read a book first, which would disqualify most of the internet. But Ann Nocenti is on Goodreads, and this is a well-populated page for it. And the synopsis for it, which I think is probably the same one as on the back of the book, is this. So let's grade the synopsis. I'm going to read it to you, and you tell me how well it captures the book.
Sure.
The bees are swarming. What do they know that we don't? In a broken down world, a rebellious group of ruthless romantics have fled a tech-obsessed society to create their own, and a few cantankerous aliens have come to harvest the last seeds of humanity. When one of them falls in love with a human, idealistic journalist Astra stumbles into a story of a lifetime, only to realize that if she reports it, she'll destroy the last hope of a dying planet. How far will she go for the truth?
Wow. That's
Does that not make it sound like Astra is the protagonist of the series?
Yeah, I was going to say that is all factually correct. Nothing about that is wrong, but I do agree that I think the focus is off on that. It's much more of an ensemble piece. That also makes it sound way more of a thriller. Now, that one of the line I did read describing the book was, and this is in the trade, I think in the opening, not on the back cover. I think it's kind of in the opening prologue-ish area. It calls it an eco-fiction tech thriller meets love story.
Yes, that was great.
Yeah, that's great. Now, the thriller part, I think, is I don't know how, maybe it depends how you define thriller, right? But that description that you read, that synopsis you read, makes it feel very like All the President's Men, kind of like, it's a journalist. There are forces pulling against. Does she tell the truth or not? Like, that makes it feel a little more like that. And that's not, I think, what the story is about. I think that's maybe a little misleading on the tone, maybe. Little misleading on the tone. I think it's a little more subtle, a little more contemplative than that synopsis would maybe lead you to believe.
And I'll tell you this too. So there are only 749 ratings of it, which is not a crazy number. It's not bad actually for a website that isn't built for grading comics.
Sure.
It's just book nerd to also read comics. That's the Venn diagram. 12% of people gave it 5 stars. 33% gave 4 stars. 34% gave 3 stars. 15% gave 2 stars, and only 23 people, 3%, gave 1 star. So there are people, and I've started skimming the reviews after I finished it, There are people who weren't were disappointed or feeling misled or felt unsatisfied, but like it was very hard to outright hate. Like there's just way too much good stuff here for anyone to not feel like it was worth my time reading this. In fact, you read the endorsements on the back. There's some big names on the back of there. I mean, and now two of these, I know how the industry works. I can sleuth these out. Matt Fraction. Where did that one come from?
Yeah.
Chris Claremont. Who got that one?
Yeah.
Who else worked on X-Men in the 80s?
Also, I think one of them is Kelly Sue DeConnick, right?
Yes, that's the first one.
Yeah. You know who she's married to? Oh, right, Matt Fraction. So yeah,
but they put Mike Mignola in between the two of those.
Yeah. But Mignola, I mean, again, we're talking about these are huge names. Mignola,
they're huge
and Claremont
names.
Are legendary. I love DeConnick and Fraction as well. I don't know if they can be called legends quite yet, but yeah, I mean, these are, again, when you have the people behind this book, when you have Nocenti and Aja, and it's coming out on Karen Berger's kind of personally curated imprint, you're going to get big names, and I think this does kind of feel like a comics person's comic, right?
Oh yeah. I mean, my wife was reading another book in the armchair, and I was reading this on the couch. And every once in a while, she'll ask me what I'm reading or what I'm reading about. And I was like, you don't want any part of this. Like she struggled, just because she's not that familiar with the medium. She struggled to make it through Paper Girls, which I will admit was not as entry level as I thought it was. The fact that you take 10 issues to really figure out anything that's going on. I mean, I thought she would like the sci-fi and the time travel, and the fact that there's really only 4 characters, I thought would make it easier. This has a bunch of characters. It's got a bunch of storylines. It's got a bunch of themes floating around.
You're dropped right into this world that is
right. There's
world,
no exposition. Right.
Yeah.
And as soon as you start to track with one story, it switches gears. Yeah. And has to me, it's like watching an indie movie, and and I don't mean like focus features. I mean like indie.
Yeah.
The little chapter breaks within the issues.
I was just going to say that there are parts versus, it's set up as four issues. So there are 4 main parts, but then there are sub parts, which you jump around to various aspects of the world, different stories, different characters. And without real explanation, there's no like clean segue
and there's no overarching narrator.
Yeah, so as narration will lead you from one story to another, and you see how they connect. It just here's part 2, here's part 3, here's part 4, and then subpart A, subpart B, subpart C, that kind of thing. So, like I said, it's a very comics person's comic.
Yeah, and I think the thing to keep in mind with stories like this is that you will probably not be able to avoid ranking those plot lines and stories in your head.
Oh yeah.
And some of them you'll be wanting more of, and the other one it's like, oh God, we're going back to this. And I had hit that point the first time I read this. Of course, that was, when there were only 2 single issues out and there was no prospect of a third issue. And even then I was like halfway through the second issue, and I was like, I think I'm just going to put it down. It's making me feel stupid. Because I'm like, if I had to explain to someone what I just read, I would be like, I don't know.
Yes, but I don't actually know. Because there are.
So to me, it's
not holding your hand. It's not holding your hand.
In fact, I think
this is what it's about.
Is perhaps just like 10-20% too much in the direction of opaque. Like I think it could just dangle just a little bit more.
Maybe
for a much broader appeal.
If they did that, it would have broader appeal. But I don't think that was their intent.
Right.
It was like this was meant to be like a 300 level course. Not a 100 level course. This was meant for people who are into the medium. And I think one thing we'll talk about is maybe. Had this idea been conceived and created now and not when it a couple years ago when it actually was, it probably would have been scripted and drawn and put together as one whole story and not as 4 issues. And I think that would have made a difference in how you approach the reading and how it ends up reading as a story. I think that affects. I think there's a change you can kind of sense it in how the story is being delivered to you between the issues that the part of the trade that came out as single issues and the part that just came out when it was all finished. So yeah, it's a more difficult read. And again, not because it's full of subject matter, like it's not difficult because it's more adult or more mature. I just think it's harder. It's a little more advanced level of comic reader. You have to be a little more familiar and be willing to accept some things that maybe a less seasoned comic reader maybe could be willing to accept.
Yeah, and such a jarring juxtaposition with Not All Robots.
Oh yeah.
Which they're both indie, they're both dystopian, they're both futuristic, they're both kind of fatalistic about the world. But Not All Robots was just, it's all out there. Like, we ended up debating a little bit, like, is it a commentary on this or is it a commentary on that? And, it's not that that doesn't make it shallow. It just means it was easier to follow the narrative. And that's not what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about the quality of the content. I'm just talking about how accessible is the narrative, not even what is the narrative.
Yes, I agree. It's very clear what's happening in Not All Robots. You can then spend time, as we did, talking about what does that mean? What are the themes about that? But yeah, at the very first level one of just what is happening here? Who are the main characters? What are their motivations? What is actually happening in this story? The seeds, I think you said the perfect word. It's much more opaque. It's much harder to see. It's less clear. Well, I think it's intentionally so because I don't think it's necessarily the point. It's less about why this is happening, or maybe even less about what is happening. I think it's really meant to be just a character study. And I think it's still, even at that, it still works very hard. It asks a lot of the reader to stay focused and maybe not connect with these characters, but understand where they're coming from and see how they fit into the story. Because again, they don't put a lot of detail in. They're not holding your hand as they go through and saying, this is what this is. This is what this is. Not a lot of narration that's explaining things to you as you go along. You have to pick it up on your own.
Yeah. And if that sounds like a good challenge to you, I was going to read an excerpt from her letter, but I really think I would just be getting into the story. So if this sounds like a good challenge to you, pick up the seeds. I think
yes.
The trade is absolutely the simplest way to buy it because it's $20.
Also the only way to buy it, I think.
Only way to buy
it's the only way to buy it. Yeah. If you find the single issues, congratulations. You only get half the story.
I was going to say, if you're a single issue junkie or there's something sentimental about single issues, you can like grab the first one and collect it, but you can't read the whole thing in that format. Just checking real quick, it is $12 on Comixology, assuming there's not a sale. So, $12 digitally, $20, you're going to get your money's worth of comic out of this.
Yes.
And you're going to get $20 worth of struggle.
It won't be easy. It's not a breezy read. The subject matter, the topics they're not light and fluffy. It's a challenging read. It's an advanced read. So yeah, if you're up for something like that, if you want to, if you're new to this and want to take it to another level, try to step up a little bit, I think this will be the most difficult book so far that we've done in terms of, again, not in terms of subject matter or anything like that, just in terms of how to read the book and being able to understand and process the story that they're trying to tell. It is a step up. And I think that, for at least for me, and I think maybe for you, Mike, that's an exciting prospect.
Oh, I love it. I mean, it's like when I was told that the hardest book to read in the English language was Infinite Jest by David Foster Wallace, I went and bought a copy. I was like,
challenge accepted.
Yeah, I was like, screw you. It took me a few false starts, and then it took going on a vacation where there was no Wi-Fi or cell phone, and I only brought 2 books with me. It was Dostoevsky, which I finished on the drive to the cabin, and all I had was Infinite Jest or Go Hiking with my in-laws. So I finished Infinite Jest in 1 week. And
sounds like a ringing endorsement. Yeah.
I mean, it just means I like a challenge. I don't like the idea that things are out of my reach, even though I felt the hurt of it here as I was struggling to get through sections of this. But by the time you reach the end,
I think it's satisfying.
It's very satisfying, and I can't say the same for Infinite Jest. Because imagine the chapters of this being scrambled out of chronological order. That's Infinite Jest.
That sounds wonderful.
It's like 7 different plots, all with their own characters, and the timeline is just completely scrambled. The chapters are just dropped seemingly at random. So anyway, it's a difficult read, but it's a good one, and we hope you'll join us next week for the complete run of Seeds, issues 1 through 4, the first trade paperback and only trade paperback. And if that sounds like too much of a challenge for your New Year's resolution, then by all means, sit out a week, and we'll be right back the next week with something new for you.
Peace.